what is it you want me to do now? Start talking?
Yeah, this
You
is.
do what you do best.
Okay.
That is talk good. He
Wait,
did
I'll go get the
ask.
toilet paper.
Well, you can start with today's date is June 2015.
Okay.
Takes a
Okay,
minute.
I'll start off. It is June the 4th, 2015. On June 7th, 2015, I will reach my 88th year. So it doesn't seem like it. I swore I'd never live this long, but apparently I have. So
We hope so. Aberration.
all my family and friends want me to do this, so I'll do the best I can. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1927, June 7th. And then my first memory was in Tulsa. We lived in an apartment house. And we had, in those times, my father was an architect, and my mother stayed home. They both had gone to Oklahoma A&M College, which is now Oklahoma State, and he had a degree in architecture, and she had a degree in what they called commerce then, which is now would be business. I remember at age 2, they used to put me out in the front yard. I don't remember anybody being with me. The maid, everybody was gone. Mother and father were gone. And the maid would put me out in the front yard, and I had sunsuits. And they were little sunsuits. One was red, and one was green, and one was blue. And they had a lattice, white lattice front. And what I used to do when they put me in the yard, I would take off the sunsuit set and leave. And run away.
That's where I get it.
And my
I
son,
never knew that the whole reason I used to get naked is because my dad did.
And my son, and it's probably genetic.
Oh, it all makes sense now.
Okay, I'm gonna call Charles so he can
Caroline,
listen.
you never did that. I want to
Okay.
be sure.
I'm way classier than you guys.
Are you ready for the rest? More
Here
stories?
goes.
Yes, more stories.
Okay, where was I? I was running
You're
away.
naked
You're
too.
running away naked.
My mother told me that one day the policeman brought me back and with sans any kind of clothes, and
Oh my gosh, that can be messy.
they took a picture of me and put it in the newspaper or magazine or somewhere, and it was this policeman, and he had me by the hand, and it was a shot from the rear.
No pun intended.
And
Yeah, we
and
can
so I
tell
was
them it's
I
Tulsa
made
Daily.
the press very early in my life. So
Destined for greatness.
I guess the next thing we did, we moved to Stillwater, and my dad was an architect for the Sigma New House in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and he was the supervisor of the construction of that house, and I think it's still there now this year. I know they thought about one time tearing it down and decided not to stay there, so I suppose it's still there. At any rate, my event there was apparently I had a problem if I disagreed with another child. I had the tendency to bite, which another one of my sons seemed to learn about. At any rate,
Yeah, unbeknownst to me, again.
this kid,
We're gonna learn a lot tonight.
that where we were staying cured me that fairly early because I bit him and he got me by the nose, and he hung on with his teeth. and I don't remember ever biting again after that.
Yeah.
So we moved at that time to Ponca City. My dad worked for, it was at that time the Marland Oil Company. Continental Oil Company hadn't been bought by Marland yet. And he was in the architecture department. They wanted to build filling stations that looked like houses. And that's what he'd been doing. So then he became quite ill then. It turned out that he had multiple sclerosis and was not able to continue working. So my mother stayed there, and my dad and I went to Muskogee, where his parents lived. And he decided he'd never been much out of Oklahoma. He'd gone to Wentworth Military Academy, he decided he wanted to see the big city, since being an architect, and they were building the Empire State Building at that time,
Oh my gosh.
and also the RCA building, and he wanted to see that. So he and a friend of his went back there, and I went to Ponca City to be with my mother. And we moved then out of, we lived in a very small apartment house for my 4th birthday, and my aunt, one of my mother's sisters, who, my mother was 5 feet tall and weighed about 105 pounds. Her sister, Marion, was 5 feet 10, and she weighed 225 pounds. So Aunt Marion made me a chocolate cake, and so I said, would you hurry up and cut the cake so I could be 4 years old? So we moved from there to a lady, another house, Mrs. Halliday, and no, her name was Holiday, because my grandmother was a Halliday. I always got that confused. But anyway, we lived there a while, and then we moved to another house with Mr. and Mrs. Royce. He was a painter for the Continental Oil Company, and they had a big tank farm, and he used to paint the tanks. Every year they'd start painting tanks, and when they finished painting the tanks, well, they'd start over because the tank farm was so huge. And Mrs. Royce was a really nice lady, and she made me take naps, which I hated. And so she would sit there and read a magazine with a yardstick, and she'd put me there on my stomach and tell me to close my eyes, and every time I opened my eyes, well, she'd hit me with a yardstick,
Oh.
which, but not very hard. She was, and I really liked living there.
of you
She
there.
did. She had a schedule. On Monday she washed, and Tuesday she ironed, and it went on like that. And I remember really liked it to help them. And I had my 5th birthday there, and I remember they got me an ice cream cone, and it had 2 dips of ice cream on it,
Yeah.
and I refused to eat it because ice cream cones were supposed to have 1 dip. So at any rate,
You read that, Brian?
before we had come to Colorado when my dad was when I was 3, and we came to Manitou Springs, and we drove up in an old Packard touring car, and then we drove down to Canyon City to see the Royal Gorge in a Pierce Arrow touring car.
Wow.
And they were old open touring cars, and they were great black, huge automobiles, and I really liked that. When we were in Manitou Springs, my mother and my aunt were there, and she had an aunt, she had a sister, and her sister's name is Gertrude, and she didn't like that name, and so they started calling her Tissy, which was a neighbor girl that my aunt Gertrude hated. So they said, well, we'll quit calling you Tissy. What do you? She said, well, Jake was the hired man. She said, well, they said, we'll call you Jake. And she said, well, I'd rather be called Jake than Tissy. So from then on, all of her life, she was Aunt Jake. Anyway, we moved out of the Royce's house, and we moved into, I was going to be 6 years old and ready to go to grade school. And my mother knew the best grade school was Roosevelt Grade School in Ponca City. That's where all the rich kids went. And that school was named after Theodore Roosevelt. They always made a point of that. And in those days, all those old guys called him Roosevelt, not Roosevelt. And Roosevelt came along later. When we lived with the Royces, Herbert Hoover was the president. The Depression started in 1929, and when we lived with the Royces in the early 1930, and the Depression was underway. Actually, it must have been 32, because when we lived with the Holidays, I came in one day and my mother was crying, and I found out sometime later that my dad had died. So anyway, one of the things that I did in the family was my aunt came out with my mother's dress on, and this was Aunt Jake. And for some reason, I didn't like Aunt Jake very well. And later, I found out why. But anyway, she came out with my mother's dress, and so I said, I called my mother, incidentally, Easy, because that's what she called herself when she was a child, because her name was Louise, and she couldn't say Louise. So she called herself Easy. And so that's what the family called her, and now I called her. And my dad, I called Kirk because that's what everybody called him. So anyway, I stood there in front of Aunt Jake and said, "Take it off, it's Easy's," and she said something to me, so I socked her and bloodied her nose.
You were how old?
I was 3. And so
You're a strong 3-year-old.
and anyway, and then when we lived at the Royces, maybe I haven't ever told you this story, Inge. My mother thought that I should learn about taking care of myself. So she took me to this guy who taught boxing. Only nobody made any explanations about anything. So they took me there and they put these big gloves on me, big padded gloves, and I hadn't the slightest idea what was next. Then they put me in this ring, and I still didn't know what happened. And so I walked out into the middle of the ring, and here was this other kid, and I was going to say hello to him, and he busted me in the face and bloodied my nose. So and then I started crying, and so my mother was very embarrassed, and so she took me home. And so I thought about that all week, and next week I was supposed to go back there. So, which we did, and I went back, and they put the gloves on me, and I went with that. They put me in the ring, and I went with that, and then the same kid was there. And so I took a look at him, and I put the glove under my arm, and I took it off, and I ran out, and I tackled him, and I got on top of him, and I was pounding him. Pounded him in the face, and then I got ejected from boxing lessons. So, I never really was a very good boxer after that. So probably because I didn't stay for the lessons. But
Hey, Dad. I was just thinking of one of the stories I love. Is that around the time that you told your mom you were going to run away?
Oh, that was later. No.
Oh, okay.
But when
you
we
have
were
to
in
tell that one when we get there.
when we were in Colorado Springs, one of the things that happened is my mother bought me a little red wagon, and it was a little wooden wagon. It had yellow wheels, and it was hotter than the blazes in Manitou Springs. It was in August in the summertime, and so we had to walk up this hill we lived in a kind of a tourist home there. That's where we were staying, and we had to walk up this long hill, and as we got to the top, I lost hold of the wagon, and it rolled all the way to the bottom of the hill. And so my mother says, "Go get the wagon." And I said, "No way. I'm not going to go get the wagon." And so anyway, she grabbed me by the hand, and she drags me down to the bottom of the hill. And I got the wagon, and she made me pull it to the top of the hill. And when we got top of the hill, I put the wagon down, and I looked at my mother, and I said, "You old devil, I just hate you." And my mother told me that story many times.
Oh, I bet.
And she always, for some reason, she thought that was very funny. That was interesting. During the Depression, everybody was worried about a job because everybody was losing their jobs. And I remember Tony Royce was the husband. He went down to the bank and got a whole stack of silver dollars, and my mother gave him some money, and she got a stack of silver dollars, and they put the dollars underneath their mattress, and we put the dollars underneath our mattress. And about that time, President Hoover was running for re-election. This was 1928, and he got 1932. Excuse me. 1932, and he was defeated, And I remember I cried and cried because poor Mr. Hoover lost his job. And that was the big concern of everybody, and I remember that totally. And things were, in the Depression, got worse. And there were lots of poor people, and by the time I started grade school, where the Depression was going very heavily. When the E.W. Marlin had the Marlin Oil Company, and he was a very wealthy, successful oil man. He loaned or borrowed money from the Morgan Bank people. And 2 years later, the Morgan Bank took over his company and kicked him out.
Wow.
Very sad story. And all of the Marlin people at that time that made over $10,000 a year, they fired them all. And I had a friend later that was a geologist. He was in Mexico, and he'd been in an explosion, was in the hospital. The rig blew up, and so they didn't fire him because he was in the hospital. As soon as he got well, they let him go. And he told me that story. But the oil company was a main thing in Ponca City. There was a little boy in our class whose name was Kenneth Neville.
Yeah, there was an orphanage, right?
And no, there was a place where the poor people lived, and it later was where the high school tennis courts were. Where they had a bunch of old World War I barracks there, and they let poor people live in these, and those people were poor. And Kenneth Neville used to come to school in overalls. There were bib overalls, and he never wore any underwear or anything underneath them. He was just bare, and he was barefooted. And one day when we had recess, the teacher said, "Okay, it's time for recess." Kenneth Neville always was very shy. He always sat in the back of the room, and he stood up and he said, "Okay, everybody, get out of my way. I got on a new pair of shoes." And everybody got out of his way. But they moved into a house later, and they were really poor. And I remember that's the first time I ever smelled poverty. And poverty has a very distinct odor. And I remember in their house, I still remember that smell, and I've smelled it in other countries and in other places, it's really a bad thing to people get that poor. My uncle, my mother's sister Florence, was married to Glenn Douglas, and Uncle Glenn took us once down by the Canadian River during the Depression, and there were people living down there in shacks made out of Coca-Cola signs and cardboard boxes, and there were hundreds of people living in the Canadian River in Oklahoma City during that time. And Uncle Glenn had a new Pontiac, and I remember we were really sad and uncomfortable driving down, and these people would look at us, and here we were in this shiny new car, and it was not comfortable at all. But I grew up and went to grade school, and I had my biggest problem there was I was the littlest kid in school by far, and I thought I'd be way smaller than I grew up. I'm now 5'7" and weigh about 180 pounds, and I'm not terribly out of shape, but I was tiny and head shorter than any other kid in school, and including the girls. So it was kind of a tough time growing up. Then my best friend was named Tom Irby. Tom's father was a prominent lawyer in town, and Tommy and I made model airplanes. And he had a sailplane that he made, and we flew it some, and it had about a 7-foot wingspan. And it crashed, and the ends of the wings broke off. So, and I remember he took it, he threw it, and it still would glide fairly well. So that day we we hooked it up, and we'd hook it to a string, and then I could run faster than Tommy could, so he'd hold the airplane and throw it in the air, and I'd run. And when it got to the end, well, the string would fall off, and it caught a thermal, and so here's his airplane, and it was big, and this thing circled up and went almost out of sight, and so we tried following it, and we thought, well, we've lost it.
And how far away from your house were you?
Oh, well, I'll tell you in a minute. Anyway, I was sad, and Tommy was sad, so he lived on about 7th Street. He lived on a street called Virginia, which is at 7th Street, and I lived on 4th Street. And I lived in the 800 block, and he lived in about the 600 block. So, and we were at the grade school, which was on 9th Street when this thing flew away from us. So I was on my bike. I rode my bike home, and when I got home, I put the bike away, and I went around to the front of the house, and here was Tommy's airplane in our front yard.
What?
And we had a hedge that was about 4 feet tall, and our front yard was very small. I mean, it was not as large as our backyard here. And this airplane had gotten over this sailplane had gotten over the hedge and was there in my front yard. So I called Tommy and said, "Boy, a miracle has happened. I have your airplane." Anyway, we did a lot of things then. He likes for me to tell. We made a diving helmet out of a old hot water tank, and we didn't have we cut the front out and put glass in, and we made shoulder pads for it, and we took it down to the welding guy, and it was a galvanized iron tank, and he had problems with it because when you try to cut galvanized iron, it makes a lot of poison gas. So anyway, we got it, and we took it to the swimming pool, and we didn't have any way really to get air to it other than a tire pump. And so we walked around in the bottom of the local swimming pool, and it worked beautifully. But the guy at the top had to pump like blazes to keep air going. And well, the problem is if you're inside, of course, if he doesn't, and as the deeper you go, the more pressure is required. And of course you're breathing this air. And we had no way to get rid of the old air other than the new air would push out. So that was our fresh air system. So we didn't really stay there very long. But what stopped the diving situation was the pump got so hot that the plunger inside melted, and we had no air supply, and that was we only used that thing once, and that was it. So, another one of my friends was I was a big deal in the Boy Scouts. I spent a lot of time there, and I was progressing in the Boy Scouts and got to be a Life Scout, which was right next to being an Eagle. Then I went away to school. But one of my friends there was collected snakes, and I had caught a snake when I was in grade school, and I took it to church, and I put the snake in my shirt. And it was a little snake called a hognose snake, and they were a lot of fun because a hognose snake, when you mess with them, they would puff up and they could look kind of like a cobra. And if you mess with them anymore, they'd turn over and act dead. And you'd mess with them, and they were dead. So and I wanted to show this to my Sunday school class. And for some reason, my Sunday school teacher didn't like that, and I got kicked out of Sunday school for bringing my snake to there. And well, anyway, Charlie raised snakes, and he had every kind of snake that there was in Oklahoma. He had at least one of each, and he had a lot of poisonous snakes. Then we caught snakes, and anyway, he milked them and sold the venom. And well, anyway, I had caught my mother wouldn't let me bring a snake home, And what happened to I found out years later, what happened to my pet snake, my hognose snake, is my mother and Aunt Jake both hated it, and apparently I came home one day and it was dead, you know, and I thought, well, it had died. Well, my Aunt Jake's daughter, my cousin Sabra, told me that those two had poisoned my snake.
Oh.
So at any rate, I'll tell you about what the other part of that story a little later. And I caught a bull snake, and he was about 7 feet long, and so you had to feed these things when you caught them, and you have to feed them live. You can't they won't eat something dead. So we had a sparrow trap, and we'd catch sparrows, and we also raised white rats. And my mother wouldn't let me raise snakes in our garage, and so I raised rats for Charlie's snakes, and he raised snakes. And so I told my mother one day, you know, you really ought to watch the bull snake eat. It's really interesting. And so she, not knowing what this was going to be, we put the bull snake in a cardboard box, and we put a rat in there, in the cardboard box. And bull snake is a constrictor snake, and so what they do is they strike the prey, and then they wrap themselves around the prey, and then they squeeze it until it dies, and then they eat it. Well, halfway through this process, Mother leaves and loses her cookies outside. So, and I felt bad about it, but I didn't feel nearly as bad years later when I found out those two guys had poisoned my snake. And then in the summertime when I was in college, I worked in a tank farm cutting weeds. When I got back from the Army, that was my first job in the oil business.
Boy, this is in Oklahoma.
And so
Did you work in that refinery before the Army or after?
I worked in the tank farm a little before,
Yeah.
and then I went to the Army, and after came back, then I worked in the tank farm.
Right.
And but anyway, I caught another hognose snake. They're really rare, and I caught this little hognose snake, and I thought, boy, it's really great. And so I put him in my lunchbox, and I forgot about it. And so I went home, and my mother made me lunch every day. So I was upstairs in my room, and I hear this really, really vigorous scream, and Mother had opened the lunchbox, and there, of course, was my little snake. So
Karma.
Karma came big time for that. We had to move inside for this filming because it started raining outside. So now we're in the living room in Golden, Colorado, and it's very comfortable here. This chair I'm sitting in, incidentally, came from my great-grandmother's house, and their house caught on fire, and they only saved two things. There were two chairs, and we have both of them, and Justin has claim on those chairs that if I ever die, and I'm not planning on doing that, so he'll probably never ever get the chair. So
Thank God.
at any rate, I did go. I went to the Ponca City Junior High and high school, and I wrestled in junior high school. And I thought I was really very good, but the reason I was very good was because when I was in the 9th grade, I only weighed 73 pounds. And all the other 73-pounders were in the 7th grade, and none of them had ever wrestled before. So I was totally victorious with all these other kids that were 2 years younger than I was. And so anyway, then I went to... I had a newspaper route, and I delivered the Ponca City News, and
You had a dog?
and I had a dog that I used to throw the newspaper. And my dog was a Cocker Spaniel that my cousin June had given me, and his name was Panama because she was engaged to a guy from Panama, and then she married the man next door. So she didn't figure that she could keep the Panama dog, so she gave him to me. And Panama was really a great dog, except the first time I fed him, he bit me. and I chased him around the house, and he knew that if I caught him, I was going to kill him. So I never caught him, fortunately, and he never bit me again, and he got over that. They said he always did that when they fed him. He was really defensive about his food, and he didn't do that anymore. All he needed was just to be chased around the house, and that ended that very quickly. But I went away to military school, and that was 3 years of the school. Was a tough place, and World War II was on, and
What kind of school was it?
and it was it was a military school. The president of the school was a West Point officer who had been discharged from the Army because he'd been hurt in an accident. And my first day in school was kind of interesting because I was so little. I was 15 by then, but so they gave me a uniform and they gave me a raincoat, and my raincoat came clear down to the ground. And they had sun helmets that we wore. My sun helmets came clear over my shoulder. And one thing I did have, I had big feet. And so they gave me the size, I wore a size 9 shoe by then. And I was just a little over 5 feet tall. So at any rate, they gave us our uniform, and I had this footlocker that my father had, and the footlocker has a story in that when he came home, he'd gone to military school, he graduated and was a lieutenant, going to be a lieutenant in the Army in World War I, and they had the footlocker all loaded, and he was ready to go off to the Army, and the armistice came in November of 1919, and he came home and he was so mad he kicked the footlocker and he broke his big toe. So anyway, I had the same footlocker in military school, and we still have it upstairs. So it may be, it's a family heirloom of a kind that's been well used by now. But they made us carry our footlocker to the barracks in military school, and it was pretty far. You had your uniform in the footlocker, and I had my uniform on, and it was raining that day. So I had my sun helmet on, which was over my shoulders, and my boots, because my feet were so big, my boots came clear up above my knees. And so I had those on, and I could only lace them. You know, if I had laced them clear up, I couldn't have walked. But anyway, they had to cut them off later. But I had all this stuff on, and I'm carrying this footlocker, and they made you go to the furthest door in the barracks. That was because you were a new cadet, which they called a rabbit, and the rabbits were, as the expression went, and said, "How low is a rabbit?" And the rabbit is lower than whale shit, was what they said. So.
And how about your brain? Say that.
Well, I had a long thing. I'll say that later. And when I was in school, they made us clean the barracks, and you had to do what's called brace, and you had to eat a square meal at dinner, which meant that you had to bring your hand up this way, and then bring the food, and then put your like this to eat your food, and you had to sit on the first 3 inches of the chair, and then you had to do this, like this, and then they'd say rest, and then you could eat, but you had to eat a square meal, and you couldn't talk. And so that was until you got to be what was called an old man.
And you picked up your footlocker?
And well, anyway, there I'm walking with my footlocker, and it was heavy. And so I'm struggling down this walk, and there's a lake there right in front of the school. And up this hill came a man on a horse, and he had a uniform on. And I, of course, didn't know who he was, and he stopped in front of me, and I stopped, and I was holding the footlocker, and he looks down off his horse at me, and he says, "Who are you?" And I told him my name. He says, "How old are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm 15, but I'll be 16 pretty soon." And this was in May of 1943. So and he said, well, and how old are you? And I said, I'm 15. He says, well, you're going to be all right. And he says, when I was in West Point, I was in the runt squad, and we were the best squad in West Point, and you're going to do fine here. So I walked on, and I got into the barracks, and the sergeant met me and showed me my room, and I told him the story, and I said, who was that man I met on a horse? He said, well, that was Captain Hamilton. He's the president of the school. So that was my first, and Captain Hamilton became a very important man in my life, and taught me a lot, and he was really a special guy. So about the only interesting thing, when I was a new cadet, you had to clean your room up all the time, even as an old cadet, but I was washing my window, and I was on the second floor, and I was sitting on the windowsill, leaning outside, washing the window, and somebody came, and I thought it was my roommate, and years later I found out it wasn't. It must have been somebody else. Somebody raised the window, and out I went, and it was just the right height that I landed. I did a flip backwards, and I landed on my feet, and I rolled backwards, and I wasn't hurt at all. It was grass below, so we went back to the reunion years later, and with son Justin, and we looked at that window. I thought I must have dreamt that, because the guy, I talked to the roommate about it. He said, I didn't do that. I thought, my God, did I imagine that? And it happened. I remember that very well. So I don't know who raised the window, but I went, the reason what it did, this was, you had to be tough in this school. So when I got back, I didn't talk to anybody. I acted like nothing had happened. You know, I went back and was cool and didn't say anything to anybody, and so.
Like you fell out of the second floor.
I just fallen out of the second floor window. Well, but anyway, I got out of there with, I had 4 years of ROTC, and that entitled you to a commission as a second lieutenant, but you had to be 21 years old or be a college graduate. They had a system there called the all right system, and every night the officer of the day would come around and say to you, are you all right? And that meant that you had not done anything wrong against the rules, nor did you know of anybody else that had done anything wrong. And if that was not the case, well, then you were not all right, and you couldn't say so. Well, they gave me a new roommate, and this kid was there for just a little while, and they put him on duty cleaning up the PX, and he stole some fountain pens, and they were, the roller ball pen was a really new thing then, and they cost $25, which was a lot of money. That'd be a couple $100 now. We were allowed, incidentally, $2 a week for spending money, so give you an idea of what $25 was. Well, this kid sold, and he offered me one of these pens that he'd stolen, and I said, no, I don't want that. So anyway, that night when they came around, they said, are you all right? And I said, no, sir, I'm not all right. And so then they took me out, and they said, well, why aren't you all right? And I said, I can't tell you. I felt I wasn't going to talk on my roommate. So they kept me up for about 2 hours, and I never told them why I was not all right, and I felt I didn't have to. Anyway, the lady that was in charge missed the pens, and that guy was gone the next day. They never ever said anything to me about that. So that was an important thing. I was we had a jumping team. We couldn't compete anywhere. The war was on. We couldn't go anywhere. Our football teams were intramural, where we had 4 troops of cadets, and the cadets played each other, but we didn't get to play anybody else because of the war. Gasoline rationing was on. In gasoline rationing, there were 3 classes of ration cards. If you were a person, just a regular person, you got a A card, and that allowed 4 gallons of gas a week. A B card allowed 6 gallons of gas a week. And a C card, if you were an executive or somebody important enough, where there was no limit on their gas. So, but they had to give there were little stickers on the C card, and they had to give one every time they bought gas. So that it was kept track of. Sugar was rationed. Bananas, you couldn't get a banana at all, because when we were in high school, I had my good friend, it was Jack Hawkins. One year I spent in the Ponca City High School, we had lunch every day, and they had banana cream pie, and of course there weren't any bananas, so we always wondered about the banana cream pie. And Jack said what they do is there is one banana that they have in the kitchen, and what they do is they get it out of the refrigerator and they wave it over the pie, and that makes banana cream pie. So, but anyway, I got out of military school.
No, you haven't gotten out of there.
Oh, yeah.
You got kicked by the horse,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then you had this date. The date
What, the day?
where your mother had to come and help with the car. Talk
Oh,
about
yeah,
those.
that's right.
Yeah, those two are wonderful stories.
Yeah, I had, that was when I went home from military school, and to get into military school, I had to get the state senator's appointment. And the state senator had two daughters, both of whom were dollies. Virginia was older than I was, and Dorothy was a little redheaded girl, and she was super cute and had like 160 IQ. She was very, very bright girl, and I had a couple of dates with her. I remember I had a date with her, and I ran out of gas. I ran out of gas in her driveway. Now this is in the driveway of the state senator. So I walked home. They lived on 4th Street, and they lived on 7th Street. I lived on 4th Street, and so I walked home, and my mother was playing bridge. She was a great bridge player, and she was playing bridge, and the ladies that she were playing bridge with was the secretary to the president of the oil company, and the president and the executive vice president secretary, and then the head of the personnel department. These are the three big deal women in Continental Oil Company at that time, and they were her very good bridge playing friends. So I said, well, you guys got to help me go get the car. So we went with one of the ladies' cars, and so here we got out, and here these ladies all are in high heels, and our car was in the driveway of the senator, and so we, the four ladies and I pushed the car out and into the street, and they pushed it home with another car, and so that was the big event. When I was on the jumping team at school, we had horse jumping, and we used to go. It was a cavalry school. We had 100 horses, and there were 300 cadets in the school, and so you rode every other day. You rode horses, and so we were one day in column of fours, which is 4 horses, and a troop had 8 men in it, and there were 2 sets of 4s in a squad. So we were riding along, and the sergeant came up between us, and this guy was a real good guy, but he was kind of a big old oaf, and he put his arm around each one of us, and his horse went ahead and stuck his nose in the horse in front, who was a mare, and that's what you call a goosey mare, and she kicked and got me in both knees. and I rode by, they got me back, and they had to help me off, and I got in, and it turned out that my patellar tendon had been pulled loose, and they x-rayed it, and it had pulled a piece of bone with it. So they just pushed it down and taped my legs out for 6 weeks, and it healed, and that was it. But
And every week they would pull the tape
oh,
off.
they had
right?
to pull, yeah, and to pull, and when I was young, I had really hairy legs, and this nurse, and the nurse, incidentally, whose name was Rambo. Nurse Rambo had these surgical scissors, and she would stick them in and it felt like she was sticking them in my leg, you know. And she'd cut the tape, and then she and her assistant they'd go 1, 2, 3, and they'd pull this tape off in one big jerk, and then they'd tape me up again. But that was a very.
You only had tape the first time, though, right?
What?
You only had hair the first time, right?
Yeah, well, it actually did. I kind of hung around. You know, there was always a little hair left. But any rate, that was I got out of school and I was waiting for the draft. So this was in February or early in the year in 1945, and I was 18 in June. So I took my draft physical, and I was 1A. That meant you were going to be drafted. But I couldn't get a job, and I finally one of my good friends' dad worked was a typewriter, a repair kind of guy, and so he got me a job in downtown in a typewriter repair place, and this guy had repair things for office equipment, mostly typewriters. So he had a panel pickup truck. It was a Ford V8 truck, and it was parked out in the back, and my friend Jack Hawkins worked there too. Well, he went off to school, and I was there by myself. Well, he always drove the truck, and Jack was about 6 feet tall, so he was quite a bit longer than I was. So it was my turn to drive the truck, and I had all these typewriters in the back, and I was going to deliver the typewriters. So, and the truck was parked facing the wall. Well, I started it, and then I put it in forward because I was going to kind of pull forward so I could pull back and get out of this place behind the office. Well, this clutch on this truck they had, which was they called a racing clutch. Somebody said, which means it's either out or in. So when I let out the clutch, the truck lurched forward, and the seat, and I was barely reaching the pedals, and the seat wasn't fastened in front, so the seat tilted over backwards, and I ended up in the back of the truck with the typewriters, and the truck is up against the wall, you know, so that guy. Anyway, I got out of that bind and delivered the typewriter. Well, so then Mr. Jones was kind of famous, and my friend Jack Hawkins said, well, you know, he's really not very honest. And so one of my mother's friends that worked at the bank called up, and she knew I worked there, and she said, I have a problem with my typewriter, and the carriage won't work. And so I said, I'll come right down. I'm now a typewriter repairman. So I went down there, and there was a little band underneath that had come undone, and I hooked it up. And so, and that was the problem. So I went back, and Mr. Jones said, well, where's the typewriter? And I said, there wasn't anything wrong with it. I just took the band up. He said, well, we could have done an overhaul on that typewriter. And I said, hell, we just cleaned it a week ago, you know, and it did not need anything. It wasn't broken. And so I was ready to go to the Army, you know, and so that's the other thing I did. I finally enlisted because the war got over, and war was over in August, and they hadn't drafted me, so I thought, well, I'll just enlist. I could enlist for 18 months, and with 18 months you could get 3 years of college, 3 years of GI Bill. So I did that, and I'm ready to go to the Army, and so a big cash register came in, one of these giant, you've seen them kind of probably maybe now you've never seen one, but they were these things were about 3 feet tall, and they were made out of cast iron on the sides, and they had.
I've seen them. I mean,
Yeah,
Oh,
the
yeah.
big.
Beautiful.
He had one of those in there, so I took it apart. And I mean, I took that thing apart with every part that was in there, and I took them and I laid them all out over the workbench, and then I went in and quit. Because I got in this fuss with him about and I told him that he wasn't honest.
About not taking in a repair that didn't need to be done.
Well, it was in there to be a total whatever repair, overhaul. And really, what we used to do when that happened, we just dunked them in this tank of stuff, and pulled them out, took all the rubber parts off, and blew that was it. I mean, his total deal was a
Solid.
it was another fraud, Anyway, so I left him with this thing. And Jack Hawkins' dad, he had to hire Jack's dad to put that thing back together. So anyway, I went off, and I did the same thing. I was a caddy before I went off to military school. And so I had this one guy that my mother's she had several bosses at one time. And this guy used to always choose me to be a caddy, and you were A-class caddy or a B-class caddy. A B-class caddy got paid 50 cents for 18 holes, and an A-class caddy got $1 for 18 holes. And so the object was he would never, and we had sand greens instead of grass greens, and you had to scrape them, and that was an art. Well, he never would let me scrape the greens, so I never could become a A-class caddy. And we'd finish, and he was the littlest guy that played golf, and he had the biggest golf bag in Oklahoma, I swear. And they had this thing to scrape the greens as well as a full set of clubs. He had all this stuff in this bag, and a big leather bag. And then I needed glasses. And so I didn't know it. So you had to go down on the fairway, and the golfer would be back here hitting a drive, and you were supposed to watch the golf ball. Well, fortunately, I had buddies that were also caddies, and they had to watch the golf ball for them because I couldn't see the damn golf. So and he would tip me 50 cents. I mean, he would pay me 50 cents, and he'd tip me a nickel.
Oh.
And the problem was you could buy a candy bar for a nickel, so that really wasn't a very good deal. So he finally took me to Wichita once to caddy for him, and I figured out the reason he took me up there because caddies up there cost $2.50. So I caddied for him in Wichita with these other men. They were all guys that he knew and guys I knew, and so he paid me 50 cents in Wichita. So we played 18 holes up there. Well, one of the things he did, he hit his drive. That one I saw. It went over my head, and this hole was right by the river. The Arkansas River runs there, and the golf ball landed in the water, and I saw it splash. So he comes walking up and said, "Where's the golf ball?" Went in the river. He said, "No, it didn't." I said, "Yeah, I saw it. It went in the river." And so he made everybody look for this golf ball, and so which was ridiculous. I saw the golf ball go in the river. So I went along and acted like I looked for the golf ball. And so when I got back within the next week, it was the week before I was to go away to military school. So I caddied for him again. So on the 17th hole, he hit the drive. This one, I got glasses. That was my first time. And so I could now see the golf balls. So he hit the golf ball, and it went in and landed in a dead tree, and bounced around in the limbs of this tree and landed in the grass that was about 3 feet high. And so, I mean, this is a tough place to look for a golf ball. So we looked for the golf ball, and I looked for the golf ball. And then he starts giving me a bunch of grief because I didn't know where the golf ball was in this high grass. So I took off the bag, and I handed it to him, and I said, "Here it is, I quit." and on the 17th hole, and I left, and next day I went away to military school. So,
So what year? Where are we now? What year?
1943.
43,
when I
okay.
went away to school. So, and then get out of school, 1945. I'm going to the Army. That's Mr. Jones and the typewriter job. I got in the Army, and I am reluctant to tell my
And when
Army
was-
stories.
When was the job where the truck, you filled it up? And,
That's coming back from the Army.
okay.
Okay. Anyway, a couple of things in the Army. I went the first day in the Army, and they said, you're going to stay here. You're not going to go to basic training. You're going to be cadre here. And they said, well, what, did you have some college? And I said, yeah, I had a year of college. And they said, well, what was your major? And they said, we're going to make you a clerk typist. Typing makes my back hurt, you know. And I said, and I thought, you know, that I'm not very good at it. You know, I told the guy, and he said, no, you're going to stay here. So he said, what did you take in college? And I said, journalism. Of course, hell, you know, I took chemistry and physics, and you know, they didn't even have journalism at Oklahoma Military Academy. So anyway, so they said, okay, you're going to be on the newspaper. So I get over, so he says, go talk to this lieutenant in this building. And I got there, and I go up and I tell the lieutenant who I am. He says, I understand you have a degree in journalism. And I said, whoa. And I told him the whole story. And he said, well, you know, you're going to have to stay here. So they made me a reporter in the camp newspaper. Now, I'd been in the Army 3 days, and it was, you know, I could tell a lot of stories about all the shots they give you, and there was one because the guy that in front of me, when we got there, they give you a physical, and then they issue your uniforms, and then the last thing they do is they give you all these shots back, you know, in the arm. And we go there. I was the second guy in line, and the guy in front of me was a big kid farm kid apparently, and the guys that were giving the shots had a huge syringe, and it had a needle that was about this long, I swear, and it wasn't as big as my little finger, but it was a great big needle, and so they have this vial of whatever they're going to give you, and they stick the big needle in, and they pull this, and they turn around to this first kid, and he faints dead away. Down he goes. And what it is they take that big needle off and put on a little bitty one. And so that was, and then I had a friend, the guy I had ridden over there with was a kid from Perry. His name was Bob Cutzinger. And Cutzinger had been the fullback in the Perry, Oklahoma football team who had won the state deal. And he was a bull. His father owned a junkyard, and this guy had been carrying around a pipe all his life. And so his measurement was around his thigh was the same as mine was around my waist. At that time, I was 29 inches around my waist. And this guy was 29 inches around his thigh. So, and he was sitting there, and they had German prisoners of war that gave our uniforms out, and all of us were totally no clothes on, and Cutzinger was standing there, and these Germans were just had their mouths open because this guy, I mean, he was absolute specimen, and one of these Germans said something to me about Bob, and I said, that's why we won the war. Anyway, so while I was there, we did a couple of things. We had the guy that slept next door to me was a very sound sleeper. And he would go out all night. He had a girlfriend, and this was at Camp Chaffee in Arkansas, which is Fort Smith. And he'd go to town, and then you couldn't wake him up in the morning. So first thing we did, we hung his bed up to the rafter, and he never woke up, you know. So when he woke up, here he was at in these barracks, they had pretty high ceilings, and there were lots of things you could tie to. So we hung his bunk up in the top of the barracks, and then later, and he was pretty good about it. And one of the things he did, one of his jobs, was to go haul the German prisoners of war were in the mess hall, and he had to pick them up and take them out to the prisoner camp. And so one weekend he said, you know, Ken, I'm going to be gone Saturday night. Would you pick up the mess hall guys Saturday night so I can leave early? And I said, sure. And he told me where to go and get them. And there were 2 mess halls that were these, and the German prisoners gave out the food and did all that stuff. And they had cooks that cooked it, but the German prisoners waited on you. So I went there, and I backed it. It was a 2.5 ton truck we called 6x, and I backed this truck up, and the prisoners were, and I was telling them, okay, get in the truck, and they're all getting in there. Well, then there were about 4 left over, and the other guys were standing in the truck, and I kept saying, move back, and they wouldn't move back, and so these 4 guys could get on them. So I put the back of the truck up. I go get in the truck, go forward about 10 feet, slam on the brake, and open the truck, and there everybody's up in the, you know, and so got the 4 guys get in, and about half of them thought that was really funny, and about half of them were madder than hell, you know. So I got dirty looks in the mess hall, and it turns out I was supposed to make 2 trips. Only the guy didn't tell me that. Well, so then let's see. Then I applied for officer's candidate school because I had been to military school and I passed, and they said you get to go, and I was all ready to go to OCS in Fort Benning, and they came over one day and said you can't go, and I said why not? And they said, well, you haven't been to basic training. So I said okay, and they said, well, you can go. There are 2 choices. You can go to Fort Benning, that's 13 weeks, or you can go to Camp Polk, which is Signal Corps basic, and that's only 8 weeks. So guess who I chose? Huh? So I'll go to Camp Polk. Well, then I go to Camp Polk, and who's down there but Cutzinger, same guy, you know. And then he had a buddy that played football with him, and he went. We went on the bus down there to Camp Polk. So first day, and we get in, and now these are all recruits, everybody, and so the first day. Oh, I didn't tell you one of the things about Cutzinger. When we were getting our shots, I was in an upper bunk, and there was a guy in the lower bunk, a young kid, and I was sitting down on the bunk, and I was shining my shoes. Been in military school, I had to shine my shoes. And this kid comes up to me and he says, "Why for you do that?" And I said, "What?" And he says, "Why for you do that?" This was Cajun. I'd never seen one or heard one.
From Louisiana.
And he had never seen anybody shine their shoes. Well, anyway, this same kid, who was a big kid, that day, Cutzinger was on latrine detail. Well, he had gone to the bathroom, and he didn't know, he had never used a toilet. So instead of using it, sitting down on it, he'd gotten up on it, and with his feet, and made a mess on the toilet, and then he left it. Well, Cutzinger comes out and finds out who's done this, and this kid, somebody said, you know, he did it. The guys had seen him, you know, so this was a big conversation topic. So Cutzinger says, "Get in there and clean this up," and the kid says, "Go to hell," and not, he didn't say that quite, but similar You know, you. And with this, Bob grabs him by he had on fatigues, and Bob's grabbed him by the front of his shirt, lifted him out of the bed with one hand and stuck him up against the wall. And this guy must have weighed 180 pounds. And he had his elbow in the guy's chest, and his feet were about that far off. And he said, I told you to get in there, clean up. And boy, that kid hit the ground running, you know. So, but the Kutzer was.
Did he show him how to clean up if he didn't know how to use it?
I don't remember that part. All I saw was that. Anyway, we get down to Camp Polk. We're there the second day in Camp Polk, and they said, okay, you guys are going to be on guard duty. And so we all went to be on guard duty. Well, these are raw soldiers. Nobody knows how to stand at attention even. So they're giving us lessons on how to be on guard duty. So, and they're going to give everybody a loaded M1, you know, so to be on guard duty. So the sergeant, who was about 40, and who was one of these, at that time, the war was over. The Army, everybody was getting out of the Army. They were having problems with people staying in that knew anything. So they offered anybody that had a rank above sergeant, if they would re-enlist, they would get their rank back. So what we got back in the Army were most of these guys that had gotten out couldn't make it, and a lot of them were combat guys. Nobody knew about PSD yet, and so we got all these people back that were disasters, and this was one of them. And he'd been a combat soldier, and now he was teaching people basic training. So they told him to do a guard mount. Well, so he forms these guys. He doesn't know how to do a guard mount. So anyway, Bechtold is standing next to me, so I elbow him, and as this sergeant is trying to do his thing, he said, I laughed. With this, the company commander sees me, and he stands right in front of me, and he says, what's so funny? And I said, nothing, sir. He said, well, were you laughing? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, do you normally laugh when things are not funny? And I said, no, sir. He said, well, did you think what the sergeant was doing was funny? I said, yes, sir. He said, do you think you could do it any better? And I said, yes, sir. We'd done that in school once a week, you know. So I get out there and I blah, 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 and I do it. And he says, I want to see you go to my office. So I go to his office, and I have a rifle with me, an M1, and I have a helmet liner on, which is what you did. And so I get there, and I walk in, and there's this PFC at the company clerk. And so he says, take off your hat. And I said, I can't take off my hat, I'm under arms, it's against Army regulations. And I was 18 years old, and I'm the smartest soldier in the United States Army. And the problem was I really did know a lot of stuff. I'd learned it. So anyway, we're standing there, and he said he's going to take my hat off. Well, and he was he was a little guy. So I come up with my M1, and I said, I understand that now that your brain doesn't get really formed until you're about 22.
Yes, amen.
I was 18.
Unless you're a man, then it's
So
40.
anyway, the guy's going to take off my hat, and I volunteered to feed him my M1. So with this, the company commander comes in, and this kid is hysterical, and so he says to me, what's the problem? And he said, won't take off his hat, and I said, sir, I can't take off my helmet, I'm under arms. He said, would you go in my office? And I went in the office, and he goes in the office, and he sits down behind his desk, and he said, now, would you put your M1 in the corner, please, lean in the corner? I said, yes, sir. And he said, now would you take off your helmet liner? And I said, yes, sir. And then he looks at me, and this is the part that I'm not. He says, "Where'd you get so fucking smart?" and I didn't know hardly what to say, you know, so I told him I'd gone to where I'd gone to school and that I'd graduated and I had 4 years of ROTC. And it turns out that his brother had gone to OMA, and his brother had been killed in action in Italy. So he says, "I need help, would you help me?" And so I said, "Yes, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, I want you to teach some classes." Anyway, so he made me a platoon sergeant, and they gave me a room. Everybody else was in the barracks. I got my own room at the end of the barracks. So 2 days later, I'm out teaching a map reading class, and the sergeant that I had laughed at was standing there watching, and he said, I forget what I did, but he said I was doing it wrong in front of all these guys. And so I said, you know, and I dismissed everybody. I said, I can't do this, you know, let's go talk to the captain. So I went in and I said, I don't want to do this. And he said, why? And so the sergeant explained, you know, that he was doing this wrong. And I wasn't doing it wrong. Whatever it was, I was doing right. And so the sergeant he was the first sergeant, and they made him the administrative first sergeant and made me the field first sergeant. Well, now I've been here 4 days. Now I've got an armband with first sergeant stripes, and not only that, I've got real sergeants, you know, guys 40 years old, reporting to me, and they all love me.
Sure.
So, well, anyway, so then I finished basic, and I went in to see the captain and said, "No, I can go to OCS." He said, "No, you're going to stay here and teach basic. We've lost your records." So anyway, I knew how to get out of that by going what to call the IG, and the guy said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to get out of here. So they made me this new set of records, and I went up to go overseas. I went up to Fort Dix, New Jersey. So now I'm kind of done with the Army at this point. You know, I had tried my best, and I said I wanted to be an OCS, and they had done this. We had two stories, and both of them had bad words in them. One of them, we had several Cajuns in because we were in Camp Polk, Louisiana, and the problem with Camp Polk is we had ponchos, but it would rain, but it was so damn hot that you would sweat so much underneath the poncho that you didn't know whether you were winning or losing by doing this thing. So this Gotro kid was really slow, and we were on the rifle range, and Gotro was on the rifle range, and he was coaching this other guy who was Henderson, and Henderson was a sad sack. Sad sack means that Henderson couldn't get his hat on straight, his belt buckle was always crooked, nothing was clean, his shoes weren't shined, you know, he was a mess. Well, so he's firing the rifle, and he's so bad that he's afraid of the M1 because it kicks pretty hard. And every time he'd fire the rifle, he'd turn away and he'd be shooting in the dirt in front of him. Well, this Gotro kid is trying to coach him, and they always sit down like this next to the man who's firing, and you're at right angles to him. Well, Gotro had on fatigues, and so Henderson fires a shot, and the ejected round jumps out, goes down the front of Gotro's fatigues. And Gotro moved fast, you know.
Time.
Oh man, he got after it. Well, anyway, he ran and ran, and this thing burned him all the way down. And he was showing us, and he had burns, you know, all. And then Henderson, I'll tell the Henderson story too. Henderson, we're coming to the end of our time in basic training, and the battalion commander was a colonel, and he was a West Point officer. And so he came down to do an inspection. It was a Saturday, and he was going to inspect the troops. So everybody's all lined up, and my job as the acting first sergeant, I had a book, and I'd write down any what they call gigs. You know, if a guy didn't have his shoe shined, well, that was shoes not shined, and put his name down, so, or belt buckle or whatever. So anyway, the colonel goes and as they walk down the ranks, why each guy comes up to present to port arms like this, and then the inspecting officer takes his rifle, and it's always like this, and then you let go, and then he looks at the rifle and looks at it this way, and then gives it back to you. And so Henderson is standing there, and he has his rifle, and the colonel grabs his rifle and takes it, and he looks at it, and he just throw up, dirty bore, and then he looks at it, and, you know, rusty dust plate, and the frogs on the sling are not polished, and he hands it back to, and this kid's standing there, and nothing's right. His shirt tail is kind of pulled out, and he's probably about 20 pounds overweight anyway, and everything is wrong with this kid. And he was so bad they he wouldn't take a shower, so the guys gave him what was called a GI shower, which was they used this soap they used to clean the floor, and a stiff brush, and they gave him a shower with that, which, you know, takes about half your skin off. Well, he'd already been through that, and so the colonel says to him, he said, "Soldier, what's your name?" And he says, and he's standing at attention. He says, "Henderson, sir." And he was really surly, and he says, "Henderson." He says, "Henderson, you're supposed to be at attention." He didn't say anything. He says, "Henderson, Jesus Christ, stand up." Henderson didn't do anything. He says, "Stand up. You look like you're pregnant." And Henderson says, "You would too if you've been fucked as many times as I have." Well, so anyway, and the colonel, here's the colonel, with next to him is the company commander, who's the captain, and then the lieutenant, who is the squad, the platoon leader, is the first lieutenant, and me. And the colonel says, "Is there somewhere we can go?" And the captain said, and we were right by the orderly room, and behind it was a supply room where they had all the blankets and pillows. And so we go over there, and this colonel like this, and we open the door, and we go inside, and in there is nothing but blankets and pillows and comforters, and there's a big pile of comforters, and the colonel sits on them, and he takes his hat off, and he starts laughing. And tears came down. And then of course the rest of us could laugh then, you know. And so, and this goes on and on. Well, and so I finally said, you know, "Excuse me, sir, but we have to go back. The men are out standing at attention out in the hot sun, you know." And so he walks out there, and man, he finished. He didn't even take anybody's rifle from that point on. And the next day, Henderson and Gautreaux left, and it turned out they deserted. They didn't go AWOL, which was absent without leave. They deserted and never were seen again, to my knowledge. I don't know what happened to those two guys, but that was.
And then the guy that you had, you know, that was gonna kill you.
Well, he pointed a machine gun at me. We were.
No, the sergeant. When
Oh
you had,
yeah,
like,
that I kind of didn't. Well, I'll tell that. The sergeant, the old first sergeant, the Duso, who was the guy that I had the initial thing in, used to put me on what's called charge of quarters every weekend. And I didn't mind because I liked to read, and that meant you had to stay there all night, and you had to walk through the barracks and check everybody, and so that didn't bother me. So I was on Saturday night, and they gave me a 45 to wear, and I had it I was sitting in the captain's chair in his office, and I had the gun hanging on the side of me, and through the door comes this sergeant, and he has a piece of a tree. It was a club, a piece of a tree, and so, and he comes in, and he's drunk. Boy, I could tell. And I had the light on the desk on, and I was reading a book, and so he says, "You little chicken shit, I'm gonna kill you." And so I get the 45 out, I pointed at him and said, "Sergeant, don't come another step, because I'm gonna, you're right, you correctly called me what I am, and I will shoot you dead." And so he left, and I never reported it. But he was gonna come beat me up with that club. But so there were lots of incidents with other people with these old re-up sergeants that because they were people that couldn't make it in
Real life.
real life, and they couldn't make it in the Army either. And the Army, peacetime Army, is a very different place than the rest of it.
And this is 1945, 46 in there somewhere?
This is 1945 still.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
and so,
nobody really knows what to do yet, because it's a new,
well, no, actually, no, it's now, excuse me, it's 1946 in Camp Polk, yeah. And it's getting in the springtime.
and no one really has an idea what.
Nobody, I mean, everybody's getting out of the Army, and the Army is a total disaster. So I was really, now I look back on it, I'm kind of ashamed, because I had, I had all this good military education, and I offered it to them, and when they didn't want to take it, well, I kind of did the thing I did with Mr. Jones in the cash register.
Yeah.
That's the way I treated the Army, and I'm now sort of ashamed of that, as a matter of fact. So, at any rate, I got up to Fort Dix, New Jersey. I was going to go overseas, and now my attitude is I'm in the Army for 18 months, and 6 or 7 months of it's gone, and I only have a year more to go, and so I'm going to serve it. Well, they kept not calling us. We'd get out of the barracks, go out to this big field, and when they called your name, well, then you went up and they'd say where you were going, and then the guys that were left, they'd say, "Okay, everybody get in the truck." And the first they took us out, and the first day we went out, we had to dig holes and put in telephone poles. And so we dug, and it's hot, out, and so we dug the holes, and we put the telephone poles in the holes, and we got back on the truck at the end of the day and came home. So then another time we went out and did some fencing, and my name every day my name wouldn't get called. So I would have to go do this stuff. Well, after a while, all of the guys that were around me were all gone. They had new guys, and I still wasn't assigned anywhere. So one day we got in the truck, and they took us out where the telephone poles were, and they had us take out the telephone poles.
That you had just put in.
Yeah, I mean, so this was,
To fill the holes back in, or?
yeah.
Huh.
And so I thought, this is just make work. There's not going to be anything on these poles. This is just. So the next day, I forget what it was, but when I got on the truck, and when I had gone on the weekend, I knew where the gymnasium was. So when the truck got to the stop sign in front of the gym, I had gotten in the back of the truck. I just jumped off the truck and went to the gym. So anyway, so they got to the thing, and the guys saw me do this. The other soldiers. So they said, "What'd you do?" And I said, "Well," and I told them about the telephone pole. I said, "These are not real jobs. These guys are just screwing around with us." So the next day we got in the truck again. So they. When I got to the gym, I jumped out of the truck, and so did 3 or 4 other guys. And so what happened is when the guy gets the truck to wherever they were going, he goes around and says, okay, everybody, and there wasn't anybody in the truck. Everybody had jumped out of the truck. So the next day they said, okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take your dog tags away. So the next day they took our dog tags, and so, which is against, you're not supposed to do that.
Right, but you had to have them, right?
Anyway, so I gave my dog tags. So, and I went out and I had to work that day. So that night, one of the guys that I'd gone to military school with, who incidentally was named Kirkland also, he's no relation. But I was telling him about what had happened to me, and he said, well, I work in the personnel office, and I make dog tags.
No.
And I said, you do? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, would you make me a couple of pair of dog tags? And he said, yeah. So he made one pair and had all the stuff on it and said A. Lincoln. And the other one was G. Washington. And so I had A. Lincoln dog tags and I had G. Washington dog tags. So the next day I wore my A. Lincoln dog tags. And so when and then I had figured out, later, no, I gave him the dog tag. And so then I jumped off the truck, my usual deal, and went to the gym. And over the loudspeaker all day long, will A. Lincoln report to the orderly room? and so, and I never got to the G. I had those G. Washington dog tags in my lockbox too, but I never ever used them, because what I found out, our barracks was built on a hill, and the first floor was like this, and the hill went this way, and underneath was a big space, and they had lattice work all around. So what I could do, I could get under the barracks and I could hear the calls.
So you would know if your name were called.
So I'd wait until everybody had gone out of the barracks. I'd go under the barracks. I would listen, and if my name wasn't called, well, then I'd go to the gym. And then I started, and then since I had all this time, I figured, well, here I am, and I was in New Jersey, and I thought, I want to go see New York City. I've never seen New York City. So Kirkland and I had since I'd been the first sergeant, I had a pad of passes. So I said, Bob, I have a whole pad of passes. So we made these passes and we signed Civil War generals' names, only we called them lieutenant or captain at the bottom, and we went to New York, and I started going pretty much every night, and I had to borrow money from I'd been saving my money. I had my mother send me some money so I could go to New York. Then I would come home in the morning, and I would go to the gym, and I found a big roll. It was a wrestling mat that was rolled up, and so I'd sleep in the wrestling mat all day long, and instead
Go to New York all night long.
go to New York. Yeah. Anyway, so finally, I didn't need the G. Washington deal, and they finally said I was going to go. I just spent part of the summer in Camp Polk, Louisiana. So they said, okay, you're going to go to Alaska. So,
You mean they finally called your name and said,
yeah, you're going to Alaska. So then I'm in Seattle, and I run into the guy that was in my next bunk next door at Camp Chaffee. He's in charge of personnel in Seattle, and I said, God, I don't want to spend the summertime in Louisiana, the winter in Alaska. So he said, well, would you like to go to Japan? And I said, yeah. So I got sent to Japan because.
And you had a train ticket and all that stuff?
Oh, well, yeah. What happened? They gave me a train ticket to go from camp in New Jersey, Fort Dix it was, and so I found out that if you're going overseas, you could fly on the Army Air Service, and you had a priority. So I went and found out, yeah, you could do that. So they flew me to Wichita, and so then I went home and for my pass before I went overseas, and then I got back up to Wichita, flew up there, and I still had my train ticket. So I took my train ticket in and said to give it back to him, and the guy says, well, I don't want your train ticket, and I said, well, and I went in and it's worth $350, you know? And I said, well, what am I supposed to do with it? And he said, well, don't bother me with it. So I sent it home to my mom and had her put it in the bank and left it there. I thought someday somebody's gonna catch me and want their $350.
Yeah.
Never did. So anyway, then I went to Japan. And anyway,
I heard the transition.
I got to Japan and I had a funny experience there because I got off of the boat and I had thought, well, the Japanese, I'd heard about all these Japanese were starving, and I remember we were up on the troop ship and I looked down and here all these Japanese kids and all of them were fat. Nobody was starving there. They were just as fat as they could be. And they all were jumping up and down to see the little kids, you know, love soldiers. So anyway, I went to the first place where they had tents set up and we were supposed to stay there tonight, and I heard my name over the loudspeaker. And I had, you know, I still had my barracks bag. So I could go, and this guy says, well, we got a special deal we want you to do. You're gonna, and this was a major, and he said, I'm with the Criminal Investigation Division, and I want you to work with us, but in the meantime, you're gonna go to this automotive maintenance school, and you will, we'll tell you what to do. You come to Yokohama, and we'll give you instructions, but right now you go to the automotive maintenance school. So I said, all right, and so he tells me where to go, and it was on the train. So I get on the train, and they said, well, somebody will meet you at this place called Fuchinobi, and somebody will meet the train there. So, and you're gonna go to the 8th Army Automotive Maintenance School, okay? So I go, I get on the train, I get off the train, and now it's night, it's dark. So there's nobody there. So why don't you sit over there so I can talk to you there. So anyway, I get off the train, I go to this place, and finally I go into the depot, and there's a little Japanese man, and there's a bare light bulb hanging, and he's doing something, and I try to talk to him, and he speaks Japanese, and I said 8th Army Automotive Maintenance School, and he says, so he takes me outside, and there was a forest right there, trees, and he takes me to this path. And now I am what my first day in an enemy occupied country, and I'm out in this woods, and the guy says, go down the path.
Whoa.
And I've got my barracks bag full of all my clothes. So I said, okay. So I start down this path, and I am scared to death. Boy, I mean, I'm walking down this, and the path was, you couldn't get off of it. It was going through, and I finally get to the end of it, and I see a light, and it was the front gate of the 8th Army Automotive. And so I go there, and I tell the guy my name, and he says, well, go to this building. And so I go in there, and they say, well, you're in they had Quonset huts. He said, you're in Quonset hut number whatever, and he tells me how to go there. And so I go there, and I get in the Quonset hut, and there are no lights on in there. And so these guys say, well, there's an empty bunk down there, so I put my stuff down. I've got to go to the bathroom, pretty bad by then. So I said, where's the head, the bathroom? And they say, well, it's in the building at the end here. And the guy gives me a book of matches, and he said, the electricity's off. And so here's, you can light these and see in your way down there, so I go in and I open the door and you know, these little book benches, you know, so they keep going out. And I'm holding up and I see this long row, it's a board and it has holes in it. And so I think, you know, what's this? So anyway, so I think, well, this must be where you do your stuff, you know. So I pull my pants off and I hear water running. And I thought, what in the world is this, you know? And it's water running hard. And so then all of a sudden there's this noise, there's this crash. Boom! And man, I'm out of there. And still with my pants down around the and there's snow outside, and I get clear outside, and then you know I'm standing out there, and there's nobody there, so I think, you know, well, you know, I gotta get, you know, I'm
Still got stuff that's
yeah. So anyway, I go back inside and I figure out there's this giant V-shaped bucket that's divided in two parts, and it has a pipe running through the bottom, and the water, and it sits up like this, and the water fills this side, and when it does, this thing dumps like this, and it runs down. There's this board with holes in it. Underneath there's a trough made out of
It flushes the trough.
and it runs down the trough.
Right.
Well, that's what it was. So that was my first night
Wow.
in there.
Welcome
How about
to
the
Japan.
monkey?
And well, then we had movies, and we're coming home from the movie one night, and I'm walking back to the Quonset hut, and all of a sudden this thing comes up and jumps up on my shoulder, and it's a monkey, and I wasn't too bugged by it because it had a GI undershirt wrapped around its neck, and so I knew it was somebody's pet, you know. So I get it back to the Quonset hut, and the thing, it's a female rhesus monkey, and it's about this big. And so I show it to the guys, and so then I think, well, and the monkey hangs around my neck, you know. So I had a box, a cardboard box I got somewhere, and I put a rag in there or something in there, and I put the monkey in there for her bed, you know. Well, that monkey doesn't want to. She wants to be in bed with me, and monkeys have hands and arms, and you cannot keep them if they want to get in bed with you. There's no way you're gonna.
Kind of like Carolyn's cat.
Yeah.
Not
But anyway,
not like a snake.
the monkey got. And the monkey didn't like Japanese, and so the Japanese people that cleaned the Quonset hut were afraid of it, because it would bare its teeth and run out. And one of the things it did, there was another guy on the other end of the Quonset hut. I was kind of on this end, and the monkey, the guy across from my bed, wanted to make friends with the monkey, and the monkey didn't like it. And he tried to make friends with this monkey, and the monkey hated him for some, I don't know why, but anyway, so the monkey would poop on his bed. And so, and he was a farm kid, and so he would put newspapers on his bed, and that was the monkey's bathroom. So, and he put up with that, and he kept trying to make friends with this monkey, but she never ever would. But she did make friends with the guy at the other end, who was about my size and coloring and everything. So we decided that his owner, or her owner, must have looked about like we did.
Right.
Because, and this guy would tease the monkey. He was the last bunk at the end, and he had petty pictures or girly pictures hanging on the wall. And he would pet those pictures, and the monkey would jump up and down and scream at him. She was jealous. And he came home one day, and the monkey had torn the picture and pooped in her hand and smeared it all over the picture.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
Wow.
and the monkey got out one day, and the mess officer, we heard later, she didn't disappear. And the mess officer had shot her because she got on top of the mess hall. So he had killed the monkey. But anyway, so.
And then he got his comeuppance.
Well, yeah, what I did was found out we were not, I saw whole sides of beef coming in to the mess hall. All we got was fish. And we weren't getting any sugar for our coffee.
Right.
So I had to go report once a week to the people and who told me, and I had other things to do. But anyway, I told them about this, and they sent an investigator down, and the mess officer and the cook, the head cook, both were court-martialed later. I played no part in it other than I called attention to it. And what he was doing, he was trading beef for fish, and we weren't supposed to eat any fish then because Tokyo Bay was polluted. It was full of sunken ships.
Yeah.
And they said don't eat any fish
Yeah.
because they're not clean.
Nasty.
And
Pollution.
so anyway, he got in trouble for that.
How about the lieutenant that had a boat?
The what? Oh, well, in it, what we used to do, Bechtold, who was a guy that I had known in basic training, turns out he's there too, and he is in charge of the 28th platoon, they called it, which was at the replacement depot. And all the black guys, the Army was segregated then, and all the black guys that were in the Army went in and out of the 28th platoon. Or they went out of it. It was a separation thing. And they had 400% AWOL. In other words, if they were supposed to have 80 guys there, they had 4 times 80 that were not there. Because these guys didn't want to go home.
Wow.
And,
You mean they wanted to stay in Japan?
Huh?
They wanted to stay in Japan?
They wanted to stay in Japan. Oh yeah, they loved it there.
My kids don't know what to do with themselves if they have an unoccupied second. And so what did you do when you were a kid for entertainment? These kids have phones and computers and TVs and they have no idea what life was like before there was television, before there was,
Yeah,
you had a
well,
radio in your house, right?
We spent a lot of time outside. We built stuff. We made scooters out of roller skates, and we took a roller skate apart and put 2 wheels on the front and 2 wheels on the back, and then we put a piece up, and it was like a skateboard except it was more like a scooter. And then later we did what was with skateboards. We did away with the upper handle, and we used a 2x6 underneath, and then it had skate wheels. And then later we took instead of skate wheels, we cut a V in a 2x6 and put a bearing from a car in and ran a dowel through the bearing, and then we had a skateboard, and we had a scooter.
But mono wheel.
But instead of skates, we had 1 wheel. Yeah, and it was a steel wheel, and we did that. I sold pop in the summertime. I had a pop stand on the corner, and a friend of mine built me a whole stand with a roof and everything, and they built the junior high school across the street, and I sold pop to those guys, and then they repaved the street, and they had 2 programs in the Depression. There was the WPA, Work Progress Administration, and the PWA, Public Work Administration, and they took all the unemployed people and they worked for the government and these 2 things, and then they had an outfit, I forget the name of it, that was kind of like Army camp, and where they put these guys. And they paved the street, they built the city building, they built a new library. One of the things that when I was in grade school, the new library was air conditioned. And so I spent a lot of time, it was only a block away, and I spent a lot of time at the library and read a lot because that was the coolest place in town. So, but I read a lot. We played outside, we played games, We hide and seek. We used to hide. The big deal for the boys was we played rubber guns, which we made a gun out of a piece of wood, and we cut rubber bands. The inner tubes in cars were made out of rubber then. They were not neoprene like and now they don't have inner tubes. But the inner tubes were rubber, and you could cut a strip off of the inner tube, and then you put a knot in it, and then you shot it at each other. And we played games, war games, which was a good thing because we were all gonna go to war.
And you went to the pool.
And went to the swimming pool every day.
A public swimming pool nearby?
And the public swimming pool in Ponca City, they drained it every other day, because they owned the water system. And so we had cold water day, and we had warm water day.
Wow.
And that water was, God, it must have been 60 degrees on cold water day. And, cause they didn't have a filter system.
Yeah.
Or anything to chlorinate it.
Oh, so it was just.
It was a great big swimming pool.
So they cleaned it out of. To freshen the water.
Every other day they drained it totally,
Like a
washed the
bathtub.
bottom, and that's where we did that pool was where we did our diving helmet, but it was so hot in the summertime that the street in Ponca City was brick, and in between the bricks they had tar, and so we went barefooted. Took our shoes off when school was out and didn't put them back on until school started. And so to get across the street, that street, you had to run like blazes and then get in the grass on the other side and cool your feet off because the tar would stick to your feet.
And you would read while you were riding a bike, right?
I was reading, they had little bitty books called Big Little Books then, and they were about this tall and they were fat. And comic books hadn't come around yet. And I remember the first Superman comic book, which I wish I had kept.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
It'd be worth lots of money. And the first Batman, he came later. And but anyway, Big Little Books were the books that we read. And I was reading something, I don't remember what. And I used to ride my bike without holding the handlebars, And so I was reading the book and going out in the street. And next door to our apartment house, there was an old German guy that lived, and he had a garage there. Well, as I went out, he took me into the garage on my bicycle. And my friend that lived next door, who was Doyle Davis, who was 3 years older than I was, saw it and took me to his grandmother's house, and it knocked me totally out.
Oh, you were out cold?
Oh yeah, broke my nose. My nose was all.
But you were knocked out.
Oh yeah, I was totally out.
I was lucky it didn't kill you.
And then nobody took me to the hospital. Nothing happened. I came to. And when I was younger, they had a tennis court across the street, and we were riding there, and I was riding on the handlebars of this guy's bicycle, and I stuck my toes in the handlebar, and off I went, and hit face first and knocked me out. And Doyle took me home.
Right.
And and then another time we were playing tag, and I fell out in the street, and knocked me out. Doyle took me home. So he always, I had
He took care of you.
series of, he took care of me.
Yeah.
And he died 2 years ago. Doyle was flew during World War II. He was a night fighter pilot, and he flew F-8 Hellcats off the Bonhomme Richard.
Wow.
And had a lot of good war stories. But anyway, so.
So does that annoy you now to see the kids that aren't? We don't know what it'll be like in the future, but the kids that seem to have to be entertained all the time.
Well,
we
just
used
built
to?
a lot of things. We had tree houses. We built our own tree houses. We had, gosh, what else?
That was his favorite.
Oh yeah, and I had a newspaper. I wrote the neighborhood newspaper, and I wrote the news of everybody on our block. And this was the 7th Avenue Gazette.
How old are you?
Oh, I don't know. I was in grade school.
That's where he gets the journalism.
And
Yeah.
Did you
That was his
handwrite it?
journalism degree right there.
Started at a young
Did
age.
you handwrite it?
But no, my mother would type it for me. I hand wrote it, and she would type it, and then somewhere I could get. They had a thing called a mimeograph
Right.
machine. No, this was or something. It was kind of a gelatin.
Yeah, we had
But
those.
it's
We
on
had those
a
in
roll,
grade
right?
school.
No, it wasn't
And
on
it
a
was,
roll.
and it was purple ink.
No, this thing was flat, and you put the first one on, and it had ink on it that went into this gel, and then you could make
Like screen printing.
25 copies
I'll be darned.
with it.
Didn't we have that in grade school?
No,
too?
this is different because
This was
And
flat.
this is
that
like
never
screen
smelled?
printing.
Oh.
It
Yeah.
stink.
Anyway, that was
Yeah.
that was the newspaper, and I sold it and the newspaper
For 3 cents a piece or something?
a
Or?
nickel, I think.
Wow, my gosh.
And the other thing we did is hangers. They give you 2 cents for a hanger, and so the people would accumulate hangers because every time you went to the cleaners, well, they give your clothes back on a hanger. Well, hangers build up. So we had our places we'd go around,
And-
and they'd give us their extra hangers. Well, and they were worth 2 cents a piece. So we did that. I sold pop. I sold magazines. I
You
sold
sold
the
pot?
I sold the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal.
Oh, Ken, the story about your father, your grandfather, and your great grandfather.
Oh, I left that out.
Yeah.
When I was 3, we were at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother had cherry trees beside her house, and these kids would come and they started stealing her cherries, and they got really brazen about it. They'd even come bring buckets and sit there and wait until it got dark. Because it was kind of hilly. There was a hill there, and so my great grandfather and my grandfather belonged to the Masonic Lodge, and they had they were Knight Templars, they called it, and they had swords. And my father, being an army officer, had an army saber. And so these 3 guys, one evening when these kids were out there picking cherries, these 3 guys went charging out there waving their swords and sabers. And the kids never came back. They were screaming and hollering, and I remember that like it happened yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was funny.
And in summers, you would visit and stay with your grandmother.
Well, I stayed with both my grandmothers.
Okay.
Well,
And,
what about the Oklahoma Dust Bowl?
well, Ponca City was at the edge of the Dust Bowl, but what we had was a lot of kids would come to Ponca City, moved away from the Dust Bowl.
Wait, what year was that?
In the early 30s.
Yeah.
And so you were there
Oh,
during
yeah.
the Dust Bowl.
Sure.
Okay, so then
Well, what we
You're
said,
on
we
the
had
edge of
the
it.
Depression, then we had the Dust Bowl, then we had World War II, and so.
man,
Before that, World
easy
War
like
One.
piece of cake. Piece
But
of cake.
anyway, it was a hard time.
Tornadoes,
Um,
Oklahoma City bombing. I mean,
I remember a picture of a house in western Oklahoma, and this house had a keyhole, and they had been in the house and they had closed the door, and there was a pile of dust, a pyramid of dust that went up to the keyhole, and it was about a yard
Did
and
it
a
come
half.
in through
And
the
it was-
keyhole?
it was a pyramid of dust that had come in through the keyhole.
but you had dust storms, because I had dust
Oh,
storms in Oklahoma
Oh
growing
no,
up.
we had
The
them.
sky would,
I
you'd see
mean,
it rolling in.
the thing about the dust storms I remember are the sunsets,
Mhm,
because in Oklahoma they have red dirt,
mhm.
and all this red dirt was in the air, and they had sunsets that will never happen again. I swear. I mean, spectacular.
Probably like they see in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, see, but that
But the sand there isn't red.
our dirt's red. See, so
We had, that's out in Moab. They have red sand.
yeah. But they don't have dust storms like we did.
Yeah.
So the Dust Bowl happened because the farmers plowed up all the ground,
Yeah.
and then they had a drought, and then it made dust, and the dust got in the air, and so it was a tough time.
Good on you, Beth. I wouldn't even.
Anyway, I was
It's because I was raised in Oklahoma, so I have a lot of these memory,
yeah.
Oklahoma memories.
I was in I guess I went to college, and then I belonged to a fraternity there, and
But that was after Japan, you still
yeah,
had,
I came back.
we're
from
still in Japan.
Well, I came back from Japan then right as I got ready to come back, I got a call from the personnel officer, and he said, come, and he had 2 files on his desk, and he said, I just received this file, do you want to go to OCS? I was-
OCS is,
Officers
Candidate
Candidate
The
School.
Oklahoma candidate school.
I was 2 weeks away from getting out of the Army.
Right?
And he said, well, if you go to OCS, you'll have to spend 2 more years in the Army after you get out. And I said, well, actually, if I go to college, I can get a commission just because I have a college degree. Or if I get to be 21, I can get one. I already have 4 years of ROTC. So I really don't need to go to OCS to get a commission. I can already get one. And so I'm gonna go to college. And he said, okay, I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee. When I get back, I'd like to see one file on my desk. This one, if it's on my desk, you go to OCS. If this one's on my desk, you go home. So I took my file and I had it until my lockbox got stolen. I had my whole Army file,
Your whole file.
my whole.
All your military
everything.
record.
Yeah.
And so now
It's
that
called
is
a
gone.
201 file. I
That
had.
is gone
It's
forever.
gone, yeah.
So what about the song that you learned while you were over there from the little
Oh, there
lady?
was a little lady that had been in Hiroshima, that was in Yokohama. I probably should talk about, Yokohama was gone. I mean, there were a few buildings in the center, one of which was the USO, the other was 8th Army headquarters. The rest of the city was gone.
Fine.
I used to go on the train to Tokyo, and that was the industrial area. There was nothing there. It was gone. In Tokyo, the Imperial Palace was still there. The buildings around it were still there, and the rest of the city was gone. They had the finance building was one of the buildings that they wanted, and it sat right next to what had been Radio Tokyo. Okay, what had been Radio Tokyo was a giant hole in the ground that they had bombed from 20,000 feet, and everybody said our bombs weren't accurate. They picked that one Radio Tokyo out at Tokyo downtown,
Ground zero.
and there were bomb fragments on the other buildings, but that building was a hole in the ground. And Tokyo was, I mean, Japan was the systems, the infrastructure was gone. Well, then after I left the first place, then they gave me I climbed Mount Fuji, and we got to the top, and it was snowing so hard we couldn't see anything. So when we got back, the guys that could come with us had stuck the truck, and I had to go back to the base, get a wrecker, go get the truck, and this wrecker was a tank recovery wrecker for getting tanks.
Yeah.
And it was huge, and it was this high to get in it, and it was and it could only be operated at night on the highways because it was so huge, and it had big searchlights on the side, and it had a siren, very loud siren. So we go through on the way to get the truck, the stuck truck up on the side of Mount Fuji. We drove through these little towns, and the record driver and me, because I knew where to go, and we turned the spotlights, these floodlights on, and then we run the siren, and all the people live in those little towns live upstairs, and our floodlights were about level with their living quarters, and so we'd go through this, and this truck made a lot of racket, it had a huge motor, and so we'd go roaring through the town with the siren on and the floodlights off.
and sometimes you'd go on the train, right?
When we rode on the train, you had to ride on usually you had to ride. They had special cars just for soldiers, just for the. But we didn't always ride on them. And Bechtold, who was my friend, that I'd been, I was over there, and I would get on the train, and they were like New York subway cars, and they had a rail that on a subway car would have straps hanging down from it, but here there were no straps. There was just the rail, and so Bob and I would get on the train, and usually it was full. If you didn't ride on the GI car, and some of the trains didn't have one, so if you didn't want to wait for that train, you just got on with the Japanese, and we'd stand up, and we would act like we had a handle, and as the train moved, we would go like this. The Japanese at first couldn't figure out what we were doing, and then by the time we got anywhere, they were hysterical. I mean, the Japanese had a great sense of humor, and we used to, a couple of times, you never see a pregnant woman in Japan. They stay home. But anyway, there are these women, they'd been to the market, and they had a little kid and a big thing, and the men would be sitting down, and the women would be standing, and Bob and I would go sit one on each side of the guy and hook our arm through like this and stand up.
Oh.
And the guy couldn't figure out what the hell's going on, We would stand up with him, walk out, and then we'd just have the ladies sit down. And all the women thought that was great, and all the men thought it was awful.
Horrible. Yeah.
It's a wonder we didn't get killed.
Yeah.
But
Because that's a tradition, right? I mean, that's a
Cultural
societal,
thing, yeah.
cultural thing.
yeah, we went against all the cultural things.
Yeah.
So sing that song you learned in Okinawa.
No, I didn't. No, this was a lady. It was Sa do ba Okinawa yo amakakure dewa shiba shiwa kade no dami dami ka okushi. I don't have the slightest idea what that means. But